Welcome back to PPSW, otherwise known as a Space Gulag, your favorite hangout place, and today we're back with another Star Wars story. Today we're doing what if Grand Admiral Thrawn joined the Rebellion, one of Star Wars' most famous characters. Today we'll be taking a deep dive into what could have happened had Thrawn joined the Rebellion. Would the Rebellion have won quicker, or would Thrawn have failed the Rebellion with one of his grand schemes? We'll be sticking to the Disney canon in terms of the beginning of the story, starting when he was first introduced in Star Wars Rebels. And for Thrawn himself, we'll be altering his moral compass. Before we go into this video, let's try and hit that like button, shoot for 2,000 likes in the first 24 hours, and I will release What If Plo Koon Survived Order 66. This is definitely a video you won't want to miss. We are also gunning for 50,000 subscribers, so join the Space Gulag if you want to be a part of our incredible journey together. If you have ideas for videos, leave them down below. I do read all of your comments, but I don't do crossovers. And one last thing, if you want to support the channel, check out the Patreon, Twitch, and community Discord. Special shout out to George Storage, Benjamin Wells for being Grand Tier supporters, and Jay Hoffman for being a Master of the Tier supporter on our Patreon. Thank you guys so very much for supporting the channel. I very much so appreciate your helping fund future projects that I'm working on currently. If you want to learn how to win a free lightsaber, watch to the end of the video, and I will show you how to. Our story begins in the midst of a rebel incursion. Grand Admiral Thrawn has been called upon to assist the Empire with a growing threat in the Outer Rim. Thrawn was a pragmatic leader within the Empire, a chess man who worked his way up through the Imperial ranks. Thrawn was someone who knew how to beat any enemy and do whatever it took to achieve such a victory. And while his moral scope in this case is slightly altered, Thrawn is still willing to dig deep into the enemy to discover what it is that they are doing and why they are doing it, so that he can achieve the best and easiest victory possible. He was being summoned to Lothal and the systems surrounding the planet. A group of insurgents known as Ghost Squadron had made their presence known in the Outer Rim, and they were defying the Emperor at every turn. Thrawn had been in other parts of the galaxy up until this point, working closely with the Emperor, who was becoming more and more unhinged by the day. Thrawn was being told about some of the Imperial projects of the future. Some of them didn't make a ton of sense to him, especially Operation Cinder. Secrets that could turn the Imperial Senate against the Emperor and lead to an uprising across the galaxy. Of course, Thrawn understood what implications of a galaxy-wide conflict could do to the Empire, and although the Empire hadn't struggled since the purge of the Jedi, and the immediate switch from a Galactic Republic to the Galactic Empire, Thrawn understood even with their militaristic might that it couldn't last forever. Pockets of rebels were always causing trouble, but these rebels were different. Ghost Squadron was much different. You always had insurgents like Saw Gerrera who scared people away and destroyed civilian houses, but Ghost Squadron was rallying people to their cause, uplifting the spirits of those under the Imperial rule. When Thrawn arrived, he began his research. It was what made him brilliant. As a tactician, he knew more about the enemy than they knew about themselves. His rise in the Imperial ranks was mostly because of his ability to use his grand strategy to overthrow any force. And while Thrawn led one of the most and largest militaristic operations in the galaxy, it didn't mean that he was shy to spare the lives of those who served under him. Thrawn was ruthless, and his job was to complete the mission, something he himself never failed at doing. He always found a way to finish the mission, and sometimes, if the losses on his side were high, it was worth it. Something Thrawn noticed upon arriving in the Outer Rim was the inspiration. The artwork of one of the members, Drew, was so eye-catching, so raw and pure of life force, while the rest of the team, with 2 Jedi in stow, was a makeup of what was in the galaxy. A lot of the Ghost Squad were people that were displaced by the Empire, 2 Jedi who survived a purge that killed nearly 10,000 of their religion, a Twi'lek of the oppressed people that faced down droid armies and eventually the Empire, the Mandalorian and their chance at redemption that would be destroyed by their own ineptitude, and their immediate glassing by both the Republic and then the Empire, which finished the job on the Night of 1,000 Tears, and lastly, the Lasat population. No, an entire civilization wiped off the face of the galaxy by the Empire. Thrawn looked it over again and again. How could a ragtag group of rebels? Well, they weren't rebels, they were survivors. And while the youngest Jedi didn't look to be the age of any Jedi that had survived the Purge, he certainly was inspired by his older counterpart. Though, Thrawn took notice of their ability to defeat the Grand Inquisitor and survive multiple encounters with the Dark Lord of the Sith, Lord Vader. For such a group to come together and even succeed was admirable to Thrawn. Unlike most of his counterparts, he didn't look down upon these rebels. He saw this gallant effort admirable, even respectable. But Thrawn's job was to wipe out the rebels and execute the insurgents left behind. It was apparent to Thrawn that this particular group of rebels was working towards building themselves a naval fleet. And while it would never match the might of the Imperial fleet at Thrawn's hands, they had survived encounters with Imperial fleets anywho. How could that be possible? Corellian corvettes and a handful of fighters, and the freighter of the main squad itself. It was an old modified VCX-100 light freighter. It was quite incredible. They'd been spreading the seeds of hope across the Outer Rim, and they had been rallying people to their cause. Thrawn leaned back in his chair as he examined the holograms that surrounded him. He had heard of other rebel pockets, and while calling the rebels was bold, Saw Gerrera and his band of insurgents were nothing more than cold-blooded terrorists, doing nothing to establish hope, acting reckless like a band of angry teenagers trying to upstage the establishment, only to be put in their place every time they stepped out of line. These rebels on Lothal didn't kill stormtroopers for sport, they didn't harm civilians and always avoided civilian casualties, and they were fond of spreading the ideals of what the former Jedi Order stood for. Thrawn rubbed his eyes and thought back to the Jedi he encountered during the massive galactic conflict. Thrawn stumbled on the name of the war, but it came to his head. It had been 17 years since the Clone Wars abruptly came to an end, and he thought of this Jedi named Skywalker. Yes, Anakin Skywalker, that was his name. Thrawn remembered how excitable and motivated the Jedi was on their brief encounter. From what the Emperor said, the Jedi were a bunch of purists following a dogmatic view of their code, but the little experience Thrawn had with this Jedi was anything but. The kid was a little cocky, but other than that, he was brilliant as a leader. Thrawn respected Anakin Skywalker a lot. Thrawn every so often would think about their experience together, and it was quite pleasant. He often wondered what happened to the boy. It was said that Anakin Skywalker was killed during the Jedi Purge. Thrawn found that hard to believe. Anakin was a poster boy of the Republic war effort after all, and he and a few other Jedi were always seen as the images of hope in the galaxy. Thrawn thought of another Jedi though. Another Jedi who was named Obi-Wan Kenobi. Though Thrawn thought it was odd that Kenobi could escape the clutches of the clone army, but not Skywalker. Regardless, Thrawn looked at the rebel holograms one last time before turning the holograms off and preparing himself for rest. As he did, he thought about some of the horrors the Empire could inflict on the galaxy. They were tragic, damning, and even psychotic. Even the plans that would happen if the Emperor were to die. The thought of destroying the Imperial loyal planets as a repercussion was madness. Thrawn laid himself down in his bed. Sometimes it bothered him knowing the things that the Empire did, the travesties across the galaxy, and while he never cared for the Jedi, he often thought it would draw on the purged 10,000 peacekeepers from the galaxy. Thrawn's thoughts continued to ramble on inside of his head, as he rolled over back and forth, trying to avoid them to get some sleep. There was way too much on his mind. It wasn't that there wasn't things on his mind normally. The rank of Grand Admiral had its responsibilities, but something about this ragtag group of survivors made him ponder if his allegiance was to the right side. He had never really second-guessed the Emperor's efforts up until this point. The Empire was all-powerful and it seemed right to be on the winning side, but was winning worth the pain and suffering it caused? The Empire committed genocide on entire planets, submitted others into servitude and slavery. The Empire crushed rebellions and massacred the survivors, leaving a public display of citizens, sometimes hanging dead in front of the children. Thrawn sat up and leaned over, rubbing his temple with his thumbs. Too much information maybe wasn't the best for him at this time of night. He never thought of the people on the ground before. It was this Ghost Squadron, as they called themselves, that really caught his attention and made him think harder about the rebels across the galaxy. The Empire had always seemed like the good guys when they crushed the terrorist activity, because up until this point, most rebels were just terrorists, attacking stormtroopers, killing civilians, blowing up kyber mines, attacking mining facilities. It was all an act of terrorism that Thrawn hated. It hurt the Empire and the civilians of it. He couldn't think about this any longer, so he got up from where he was, and he moved to an adjacent room as he went to a little panel and pressed some buttons. A couple of Imperial sentry droids, which were the precursor to the Imperial Dark Trooper project, turned on. Thrawn threw his fist into the wall, leaving a small dent and scarring his hand. Another unwanted thought. Empire crushed a droid army and now was funding to create one of its own, except this one would be used with the Clone Wars veterans as the interior of every droid. It was torture for those men who served both the Republic and the Empire unconditionally. Maybe the Emperor's motives weren't correct after all. Thrawn turned on the droid and began to fight it, as he tried to push away all of these thoughts. This would work for a while, as he tired himself out and put himself to bed. The next day would be full of interactions. Lothal had a new governor by the name of Price. She was a brute of a woman, but she was now in command, where the former governor failed. Price was here to straighten up Lothal, and so her suggestion was to punish the populace for the actions of the few. As Price suggested these, Thrawn agreed to her terms, as she requested a garrison of troops to be placed inside of the capital. When Price left, one of the Imperial agents entered the room. He was a red-headed and bearded individual who had a commanding presence. Thrawn didn't really know Callus, but he immediately sent him out to search for the rebels. Thrawn returned to the silence of his thoughts just as he liked it. Though His thoughts ravaged on. He opened up all the holograms looking at any possible locations the rebels could strike at. In Thrawn's mind, he can consider these people rebels. They weren't terrorists per se, they were more so liberators, and they were building a cause. It wasn't long ago that they captured some hammerhead corvettes. These moves weren't dumbfounded, they were desperate with motivation. Thrawn knew that if they had the motivation to steal dinosaurs like those ships, it showed the incredible lengths that they would go to succeed. Their cause was rallying people not just on Lothal but throughout the entire Outer Rim, and while Thrawn was enjoying this little game of cat and mouse, he couldn't help but think that it was a bit inspiring that just a colorful group of rebels and their symbol, drawn by the team's Mandalorian, inspired people to join their cause. It was truly remarkable in Thrawn's mind. Over the coming weeks, Thrawn would have more close encounters with the Ghost Squadron, and his inspiration would continue to grow. He was motivated to catch them, though internally Thrawn felt different, and yet he couldn't understand why that was. He felt motivated, though not to play this game of cat and mouse. He wanted to play another game. But was it true? Did Thrawn really think betraying the Empire was the best bet for him? If he was caught, he'd be killed immediately, and if he did aid the rebels, would they even succeed? He was able to succeed with the might of the Empire, but with the lack of resources the rebels had, would he be able to do it? What about if they won, though? It was unlikely, but Thrawn felt intolerant of the Empire's treatment of the galaxy. Even upon studying an early event in the Ghost Squadron's rescue, he saw that the squad confronted a group of stormtroopers and Agent Kallus to rescue some enslaved Wookiees. There was something in Thrawn's heart that didn't feel right about the operation he was running against these rebels, though it would take about another month worth of chasing these rebels for him to complete his decision regarding the rebellion and supporting them. Under the codename of She, short for his flagship's name, Chimera, it was quite simple, and Thrawn obviously intended it to be as such. No one would ever assume the Grand Admiral of the 7th Fleet would ever betray the Empire. He was the butcher of the rebels and the right-hand man to the Emperor himself. Thrawn's easy pass-off would be an overeager Imperial officer who was good at leading, but bad at playing the long-term game. It would thin out the Imperial ranks so that they would have less to work with, and Thrawn knew that he could set up anyone in the Imperial military to fail, even Yularen himself. Thrawn was cunning and brilliant, using She to reach deep space frequencies would work to perfection, and so it did. Thrawn's first communication was an Imperial scheduling. It gave the rebels information of all the security measures and troop, fleet, and fighter movements. The rebels would be able to use this to strike at key locations across the Outer Rim, but specifically on Lothal, which seemed to be one of their main targets. With the Empire building up bases and militaristic outposts across the Outer Rim, the rebels had such key information led them to new possibilities. But because Admiral Thrawn was a Grand Admiral, he had more to offer to the rebellion. After their first successful mission with him, he would provide them with key information regarding a top-of-the-line vessel. It was a ship being prepared for the Imperial core fleet, though the vessel wasn't being built at Kuat, the main Imperial shipyards. The ship was being constructed at the Fondor shipyard, and again, through the communication, Shai reported all the information regarding the Fondor shipyard. Based on Thrawn's intel, the rebels, with 40 or so members, would be able to sneak upon this vessel, turn off its signal so that it wouldn't be tracked, and take the massive ship into deep space. The ship had about a week until it was fully ready to be manned and shipped off to the main fleet of the core. Because the ship was so large, the Empire thought it was fine to leave it alone. Most of their troop movements were spaced out just enough where it would be hard for anyone without its knowledge to sneak in and get out undetected. The rebels' plan had to be concise and very articulated. The ship they were going to steal could be stolen, but they had to sneak into it after the first movement, clear the ship of Imperials, and prepare the coordinates for a jump to hyperspace. After the second movement of troops, they would cut the signal and then jump into deep space where it couldn't be tracked. The only issue for the rebellion was the fact that they didn't have a large enough group of rebels to fully staff a Super Star Destroyer. Thrawn of course knew this, but one less Super Star Destroyer on the front lines was one less for them to have to fight. And while this could be a very difficult task, if the rebels amassed a large enough task force, they could remove a completely finished Super Star Destroyer from the Imperial ranks. If they managed to rally more to their cause, maybe they could use it in combat. But mostly this operation was to remove the SSD from the Imperial hands. Thrawn then informed the rebellion that the 7th Fleet would move away from Lothal and leaving it open for attack. When the rebels received this intel, they were a bit shocked. Having this kind of ship could seriously set the Empire back, not much, but a little, and put true fear into the hearts of the Imperials. Because of the Imperials' lack of knowledge on the rebellion's movements and troop sizes and fleets, having something so large go missing would make them assume the rebellion was larger than it really was. Thrawn knew that this would have inverse effects on the people across the galaxy, but that was all a part of the plan. If the rebels stole an Imperial vessel and the Empire cracked down, more people would rally to their cause. It was a reverse psychology guttural feeling that Thrawn had, and he himself didn't know if it would work. But based on everything the Empire had been doing since the Jedi Purge, it seemed as if it would work directly into his hands. The only issue was that Lord Vader would probably be sent to return to Lothal, or back to the front lines to assist Thrawn with the rebel threat. That would be an unforeseeable event, but Vader always was playing into the laps of the Imperials. Though Thrawn had one key thing to do, he had to make this fall onto the head of an Imperial officer, and so he sent a prideful young, high-ranking admiral to the Fondar shipyards. Thrawn manipulated the system with a couple of astromechs that he had reprogrammed himself, accompany the admiral. The time would come for the assault. Thrawn had no idea if the Ghost Squadron would be up for it, but as the time passed, one of the captains of his ship came running into his office. Thrawn continued studying rebel movements with the holograms all over his room, as he turned to see the panicked Imperial captain. Thrawn was concerned, and so he asked what the issue was. The captain tried to catch his breath as Thrawn grabbed his shoulders and demanded to know what was happening. The captain muttered the words as Thrawn pulled off his best acting performance ever. He told the captain to prepare the 7th Fleet as he was speedily walking towards the door. The captain followed closely, keeping up with the Chiss man as he sped his way to the command deck. Thrawn got to the command deck and orders rang out of his mouth as he commanded the entire 7th Fleet to abandon the sector. Fondar had a massive break-in. Governor Price asked about the rapid departure, and Thrawn reported the rebellion had just captured an SSD, and they needed to get to the Fondar shipyard to stop it before it escaped and caused chaos across the galaxy. Though this perfectly timed operation would succeed even more when the rebels invaded Lothal with a bunch of X-Wings destroying the Imperial base stationed within the city. Only weapons and vehicles were destroyed as civilian uproar began. Their time to riot and take back the city was theirs as the signs of hope fled into the air, and the Phantom arrived to lead a riot against the Empire. The Phantom stayed around Lothal as Chopper, Ezra, and Kanan led the riot against the Empire on the ground. Without any walkers or turbolasers, their troops were unprepared when a rallied citizenship stormed their flaming remnants of the base, with 2 Jedi leading the assault. The rebellion was growing, and people of Lothal were about to show the Empire what the rebellion could achieve with such a focused effort. This rallying cry at Lothal would be a call to arms for the people of the galaxy, and with an SSD lost to deep space and the 7th Fleet completely out of the picture for the moment, the rebels who left the SSD returned to Lothal to rally the population a victory cry that would be heard across the galaxy. The Empire would see protest more, and the riots against the oppression of the Empire would begin to take foothold across the galaxy. Thrawn hadn't anticipated such a swift victory on Lothal that would prove to ignite the torch for the rebellion. Thrawn knew the Empire would move to stop these protests, and so the rebellion had a better chance to seize the moment than ever before. If the rebels could take down an Imperial shipyard or find a bunch of starfighters, they'd be able to capitalize off of this major distraction. Thrawn, using the Galaxy rallying cry, would bolster the rebellion with another small victory, and so Thrawn found the next place for the rebels to seize the moment. An unguarded Imperial docking yard with the skeletons of the Republic's ARC-170s and Y-Wing bombers was located in the skies of Biss. There was also some quick fighters known as V-Wings. Thrawn reported this information immediately to the rebellion. As for the Admiral, who was at Fondar when the SSD was lost, happened to be en route to the yards at Biss. The rebels and Thrawn were unaware of this, but the Admiral was in for the surprise when he exited hyperspace. The retired ships of the Imperial shipyard made their way out into space as they encountered a singular Imperial Star Destroyer. The Y-Wings were still equipped with ion torpedoes, and as the rebels saw the ISD coming their way, they moved into evasive maneuvers as they opened fire with their torpedoes into the hull of the ISD, knocking its systems offline. The ships had one chance to do this right, as a quasar jumped in from hyperspace and opened its hangar bay doors. As the several fighters landed inside the ship, it wasn't long before the quasar escaped the clutches of the Empire. The striking young admiral was eventually terminated by Lord Vader for the escape of the SSD and the escape of Old Republic air support. The rebellion was growing, but the biggest issue was the lack of people to fill the roles needed in the rebellion's navy, all of which would be changed when Admiral Akbar and Admiral Rallis from the planet Mon Calamari would join the ranks of the rebellion, providing an MC-75, a couple of winged MC-80s, and Admiral Akbar's personal MC-80 Home 1 variant. The rebellion was growing and the Empire cracked down on it. People fled to join the rebellion because of this crackdown. All along, Thrawn played the game, telling his troops information of recently abandoned rebel bases to keep the Imperials thinking that he was just a step behind when he was really 2 steps ahead. Thrawn was filling the role that Palpatine filled in the Clone Wars, yet Thrawn's tactics allowed the rebellion to keep building while sustaining minor losses. For the Empire, their fleets became larger but more scarce. The fear of the SSD on the loose kept Imperial systems in a constant state of fear, though the Empire didn't know that the SSD, being named the Burning Hope, was inoperable. Though the level of new recruits, both civilian and from the Imperial ranks, were starting to fill the ranks of the rebellion, the Burning Hope had a little ways to go until it could operate against the likes of the Empire. The Empire's fear was immeasurable. They combined fleets together because they didn't know if this Imperial Super Star Destroyer would come out of hyperspace to eradicate their fleets. As the clock ticked around 1 BBY, the Empire was in fear, but it was also operating like it was in power, by cracking down on worlds with riotous populations, while the rebellion bolstered hope. That symbol that the Mandalorian Sabine Wren created became a calling card for the rebels across the galaxy. Imperial High Command stressed that they needed to learn the location of the Rebel Alliance and destroy it, before they took a key Imperial world. While Thrawn sat in on these hearings and obtained very classified information that only he could know, making any disclosure of this information could possibly become his downfall. Though, it was at the same time that he discovered the secrets of an Imperial traitor giving out information, named Fulcrum. Thrawn wanted to take advantage of this, Agent Kallus, and so he requested Kallus to his room. It was a bit of a worrisome request of Kallus. Thrawn was always brilliant, but was he brilliant enough to find the traitor amongst the ranks of the Empire? Kallus was unsure, but when Thrawn handed him a small hard drive and told him to take it to the planet Atalan, Thrawn told Kallus to travel there alone. There was an Imperial senator there that needed this file, and as Thrawn put it, because of the Imperial security being so high, he needed it to be personally delivered so that the rebels were not to intercept it. Kallus asked if there was anything else the senator needed to know about it, and Thrawn told Kallus that the password for everything in there was the first 3 letters of his flagship's name. Chai, C-H-I. Kallus was still unsure what this could be. He didn't know if it was a trap or not. But Thrawn's strategy was grand in comparison to that of what the Rebel Alliance had. The Alliance had a great long-term plan, but Thrawn's plan had a short-term resolution and a plan for longevity in the case of a galactic-scale war happening. Thrawn had been orchestrating the success of the rebellion from behind the scenes, but it was the rebels themselves who inspired hope. Though there was one insurgent that Thrawn had to deal with to keep up this rebellion. Thrawn deployed the 7th Fleet into the Mid-Rim territories as he planned out an irresistible trap for a group of rebel insurgents. Thrawn had been tracking these rebels for years, picking up on their attack patterns and their normal targets. Thrawn set up a target on the system of Bothawai. It was a system this local group of insurgents had been migrating around, and the target was a Kyber crystal garrison. Everything seemed normal up until when Saw Gerrera and his men attacked the convoy, and then everything changed. ATSTs and death troopers rained in from all sides. Thrawn had to make this execution public and make sure it was brutal enough to force the people of Bothawai to join the rebellion. They had been teetering for a little, but this would push them over the edge. As the rebels tried to fight back, they were pinned down and then surrounded. It wouldn't take much to capture the remaining rebels and Saw Gerrera himself. The men from the bait crew were killed in combat, but that was perfectly acceptable for the result that was coming of this. Saw Gerrera and his remaining men were brought into the city square. Thrawn's captain would go down to the surface and announce the public execution of these terrorists. Thrawn from space would receive praise from the Imperial leaders across the galaxy. Saw had been slipping their grip for the longest time. Before the public, Saw Gerrera and his band of terrorists were executed, and then their bodies were hung from the town square as a reminder to fear joining the rebellion's cause. But this only resulted in more resistance towards the Empire. Another cunning scheme from Thrawn, ensuring his ability to stay reputable while killing a genuine hurting factor to the Alliance, and forcing another planet to join the Rebellion's claws. Killing Saw Gerrera was a good move for Thrawn because he only bolstered support for the Empire because of his terrorist acts. Killing him off bolstered support for the Rebellion. As the 7th Fleet deployed elsewhere, Bothawai became known as a hub for rebel recruitment within the Rebellion. With Imperial fleets stretched out thin because of their larger numbers, Thrawn took the opportunity to move his fleet into the Outer Rim, where the planet Scarif was. He had urgent business on Scarif, and so he went there with his fleet. He knew most of the Imperial projects, but though to close locations and everything, he did not know all the knowledge of. He was going down to Scarif to acquire all the information that he needed for his little treachery project. Thrawn's plan was almost coming to complete success. With the new bolster from planets and systems surrounding Bothawai, the rebels now had enough people to minimally crew the SSD that they had stolen. They would also be able to crew the rest of the fighters and everything else that came along with it. Now, Thrawn was going to seize the moment, and with a grand scheme that would require 2 sacrifices, he prepared the ultimate destruction of everything the Empire had. Thrawn, over the years, learned of a disgruntled scientist, one that Director Krennic oversaw, named Galen Erso. Well, it was going to help be the undoing of the Empire by revealing the location of the Death Star project, currently being known as Project Stardust. Whereabouts of the Imperial fleets and the Death Star project being prepared, the entire downfall of the Imperial naval structure would commence. It would be a risky move, even for the Rebellion, but it could displace the Imperials entirely, removing their power from the universe. Thrawn had been preparing this over the course of his turn by having the Rebellion acquire itself 2 interdictors. These ships were equipped with gravity well generators. They could very easily pull apart the entirety of the fabric of the universe if used improperly. They were the reason why Imperial scientists wanted to keep interdictors away from each other. From what Thrawn understood, he could use these as some sort of super weapon, but the Rebellion needed 2 sacrifices, and the Rebellion had to be willing to risk its fleet. The plan was quite simple. They would amass their fleet outside of the now abandoned Kamino system, only a jump away from Geonosis. From there, the rebels would jump a clump of their fleet into Geonosis airspace. When they did, a trap would be sprung by the Empire, but then immediately the trap would be unsprung by Thrawn himself. The trust of the Rebellion hinged on this moment. And while the Empire had other interdictors past the core towards Ilum and Yavin space, there was no interdictors near the Death Star in this time. Thrawn warned the Emperor, who was currently inside the Death Star, that the rebels might be amassing a fleet for an assault on the Death Star from Kamino. Palpatine was a bit unsettled by this, but then Thrawn assured Palpatine that everything was set in motion for a catastrophic Rebellion loss. 2 of the Imperial's largest fleets had been laid outside of the range of Geonosis. These 2 fleets would be asked to jump out of hyperspace and catch the rebels off guard when they were to attack. Sidious was unsure of this plan. Something didn't feel right within the Force, but Thrawn assured Palpatine that these 2 fleets moved quickly in from the core and the mid-rim. Both fleets had their own Super Star Destroyers, and they were amassing because of the assumption that the Rebellion was going to bring their SSD to the battle over Geonosis. The stage was set for the most pivotal battle in galactic history. The weight of this battle hinged on absolute perfection from a ragtag group of sign-ups and the brilliance of Admiral Raddus and Akbar alongside the will and determination of 2 brave souls who had likely no chance of surviving such an encounter. Thrawn had everything set in motion. 2 of the largest Imperial fleets in the galaxy, the Death Star, 2 interdictors, and the Rebellion's finest men, all ready for combat. The mission was simple. For Raddus and Akbar, they had to get in and get out as fast as possible. The go signal was set as a Rebellion fleet left the staging grounds at Kamino. Massive Mon Calamari ships and a few Republic vessels entered hyperspace. The hearts of the Rebellion and the hope of everything was on this mission. Of course, the Rebellion still had the burning hope to lead assaults, but this was most of what the Rebellion had in naval combat. The rebels exited hyperspace and came face to face with a massive superstructure. It was unnerving, but both Akbar and Raddus kept their men together as they lifted forward shields to maximum power, as they prepared for their coordinates to jump to Hypori, a system right next to Geonosis. And then it began. 2 massive fleets from hyperspace emerged. It was the largest Imperial presence in the history of the galaxy. The rebels saw everything that came their way, but the go signal was set as the rebels jumped back into hyperspace, when not more than a second later 2 interdictors emerged from hyperspace. The Imperials, assuming that it was Thrawn's plan, were caught off guard when their gravity wells shot on, and their engines at max speed collided into one another, creating a massive chain reaction. With the gravity wells on both ships colliding with one another, no one in either of the ship could get away. Palpatine looked on as the two interdictors collided together, as a massive array of colors shot out, and then darkness. As a massive black hole opened, larger than anything seen at the Maw, opened up, and the Imperial fleet began to get sucked in. The planet Geonosis, which already lost its entire population because of the Empire, began to move as destroyers, fighters, and the Death Star began to crumble together. Because of this gravity well, the Imperial fleet couldn't jump to hyperspace, and the black hole sucked everything in. Hulls opened up and men were sucked into the black abyss of the hole, and the Death Star began to crumble as its reactor set off a massive chain explosion that sent a shockwave through anything not broken already. Imperial ships got sucked in as their hulls ripped apart. Everyone within the location were being sucked in. Thrawn, who watched from a hologram inside the Death Star, saw the first little bit of it until the communication was cut. The black hole swallowed everything, including remaining pieces of the Death Star, the Emperor, and the SSDs, the fleets, and Geonosis, and the planets surrounding it. The victory would be a tragedy for the Empire, as they lost millions upon millions of souls to the grand scheme of Admiral Thrawn. Of course, for Thrawn, things would only get better. Instead of pomp and circumstance in the arms of rebellion, he became the new leader of the Empire. Of course, there were the precautions that were put in place by the Emperor for after his death, but most of his loyalists were killed in the tragedy of Geonosis. Most Imperials assumed that the rebels had perished too, but of course, they hadn't. The rebellion had all of its trust in Grand Admiral Thrawn, otherwise known as codenamed Chi. Their entire fleet got out of the system before the Death Star exploded and the entire Imperial fleet was sucked in. The mission to destroy the Death Star was a complete success, and now the locations of every other project in the Imperial arsenal got sent out to the rebellion. They now had knowledge of Operation Cinder and other of the post-Palpatine death precautions the Empire was going to take. The rebellion, with a fully staffed Burning Hope and two larger fleets led respectively by Aratus and Akbar, began to move swiftly to ensure the stop of any Imperial actions that resulted from Palpatine's death. But Thrawn ensured that the 7th Fleet and the other massive fleet were split up several times as they moved across the core, in smaller numbers to fight back the ever-growing rebellion. The rebellion's fleet was growing into something much larger than even what the Imperial Navy had to offer. Thrawn knew that the Imperial Navy would struggle as it spread out across the galactic core, trying its best to beat back the rebellion at any turn. But these rebels were different. They were massing, and there was no force in the galaxy at this point that would be able to stop their pursuit of justice across the galaxy. Thrawn had two options. He could ensure his longevity with the rebellion, or he could continue to serve the Empire and whatever followed, as he continuously reported on Imperial activity after the war. It was very apparent to Thrawn that the galaxy had enough of the Empire, and it was time to rejoice. Though Thrawn had to be honest with himself, it seemed as if the Empire was destined to lose this galactic conflict. And even more so, it seemed as if the plans Palpatine established for his post-death were already being reduced to ash because of the information leak from Scarif. With two Jedi arming the ranks of the rebellion, Jedi felt safe to return to the mainstream. Vader, on the other hand, hadn't been heard from since the Battle of Geonosis. Most people assumed he was killed in the explosion in the fleet over Geonosis, but he had gone missing since Geonosis fell. Thrawn's plans worked as the Imperial structure collapsed and Coruscant ate itself from the inside out. Politicians, if not killed in the multiple riots, were ousted from office for failing to keep Palpatine out of power. The people across the galaxy rallied behind this victorious, rebellious movement, and while the loyalists to the Empire still existed, they had little to believe in a successful Imperial victory. Most of these people profited off of the war machine that was the Empire, especially at shipyards on Kuat and Fondor. Though with an SSD roaming around and multiple other powerful rebellion fleets, Thrawn made his choice as he decided it was time to move the fleet into a more defensive position. Thrawn knew that if he joined the rebellion now, he could never be able to aid them if the Empire began to rebuild. And because it was now Thrawn and Palpatine's afterlife contingency plan, it was hard for him to give up on aiding the rebellion, as he took the Empire into hiding out in the unknown regions where he had been known to serve before he ever got entwined with the Empire. Multiple years would pass. The rebellion had fully conquered the Empire and stopped every single one of Palpatine's contingency plans before they could ruin the galaxy forever. As for Thrawn, he kept a watchful eye on the rebuilding of the Imperial remnant and ensured that every success would be met with two failures. Thrawn actually kept feeding information to the Republic, which they were now named, as it repelled into an absolute power in the galaxy. The Republic was rebuilt quickly, but even more so than that, the Jedi Order was given a chance to rebuild, with Obi-Wan Kenobi heading the Order alongside of a decrepit and dying Master Yoda. A growing Jedi Order meant for ever more poignant death to the Sith. But the Empire was still a looming threat. For Thrawn, it was only a matter of time before the Imperial remnant was brought to justice, and with everything exposed, the Republic was sent the whereabouts of the cloning facilities for Palpatine. The Republic remained militaristic based on Thrawn's reports from the different sectors from space. Without someone to overrule the power of Supreme Leader Thrawn, no one could try and call him out on his power. There wasn't much the Remnant could do. Every time they escaped the clutches of the Republic, they ran into another wall. Thrawn continued his onslaught of the Empire until they were chased to the ends of the galaxy. Thrawn finally gave up the game once the Empire had its final stand over Megiddo. The last few Star Destroyers faced down Thrawn and the rest of the Republic forces. Without any Imperials willing to surrender, they were completely wiped out. After the final stand of Megiddo, the Republic celebrated their victory. Planets across the galaxy rejoiced in its efforts to succeed in destroying the Empire. Thrawn would be congratulated before the entire galaxy and would be seen as a hero of the Republic. Thrawn would join the Republic Navy and rank as the highest ranking officer within it, as a lead coordinator of militaristic operations. Thrawn would help the Republic establish a lineage of peace in the galaxy. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is our story. Again, special thanks to George Story, Benjamin Wells, and Jay Hoffman for supporting the channel. Let's hit 2,000 likes on this so we can see what if Plo Koon survived Order 66. If you want to see a what if, let me know down below. I do read all of your comments. Check out the Twitch, Discord, and Patreon if you want to be a part of our community or support me in other ways. Now, here's how you win your lightsaber. You go down below. There's a handy dandy little link for a docs. You click on that docs, and then from that docs, you go and you write your name. You write your cool name down. You can put your email or whatever. Just read the list. There's all the information you need on the doc itself. Anyways, this is our story. I'm pretty content with it. I had a much different ending, and honestly, I think this ending that I just wrote was much better than the original one. I didn't really want to focus on the rebellion that much. I really just wanted to focus on Thrawn. I thought Thrawn would be much more interesting to focus on in this story, and that's why I made the story literally just about Thrawn. There wasn't really any importance to adding any other characters to it, other than a couple other characters to help the story progress a little bit further, but I think Thrawn would have been a perfect addition to the rebellion. Now, I think it would have been really interesting to see if Thrawn was at the battle of the second Death Star over Endor as a rebel officer, but Thrawn was just too smart, and honestly my original intention was to have Thrawn join the rebellion and become a part of that movement, but I don't think Thrawn would have done that. I think he would have stayed behind his lines and taken advantage of his role. His role was Grand Admiral, and he was like closest to the Emperor. He was the other person that wasn't Grand Moff Tarkin that was close to the Emperor. So, I mean, his ties were literally as close as they could get to the most powerful person in the galaxy. So why would anyone believe that he would betray that person? No one would believe that. No one would believe that. So as he continued to show his power, and as he continued to blame other people, other high-ranking military officers, he could blame Yularen, he could blame anybody he wanted and get away with it. And I think that's what would happen here. I think he would take advantage of his power, and I think he would do good for the rebellion. I don't think he would just join the rebellion. He wouldn't just leave and out himself. I think he would take advantage of his rank and everything that he could take advantage of. I mean, he could literally get information from anybody. He could ask Palpatine about anything he wanted. And after killing Palpatine, he would have had all the information out there. All the information would have been out there from Scarif. Instead of just one thing, it would have been everything. So, I do hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, leave a like down below and subscribe, share, do all those things. We're making our way for 50,000 subscribers. So, I love you all. Spread the love. And always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.